Adeline Cross set her tray down on the bar and asked the barman for the chipped glasses. The cracked ones. The ones set aside each week for the ash heap. She asked plainly. She did not lower her eyes. She did not explain herself, and she did not wait to be told no. Down the bar, a widower named Elias Vance heard the one thing she did not say. She had a plank house at the edge of Halloran, 2 window openings in it, both covered in oiled paper that let in a little gray light and no heat at all. She meant to grind those broken shards down and set them in the frames herself. She never said that part. She didn't have to. The next morning it was already a story. A girl like that, Mrs. Fry told the whole aisle at the Mercantile, wants glass for her windows. Say it that way and you can hear the sneer folded inside it. 40 men had been on the saloon floor that Saturday night. One of them wasn't drinking. The following Tuesday, a freight wagon stopped at her door. 12 lights of window glass, a tub of putty, a glazier's knife, and a man who knew how to set them. No message came with it. No name. And there the road forks, so I'll stop the wagon right there for now. If you believe love is built with 2 pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments the coldest place you ever tried to keep warm. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, and let me go slow, because this one earns it. Halloran sat at 4,000 feet in the Nevada high country in the winter of 1881. The Comstock was already going quiet by then. The big silver had been dug and shipped and spent, and the men who chased it were drifting off to the next rumor. What stayed behind was a town that had built itself for 10,000 and now held maybe 2. Empty storefronts. A church with a bell and thin attendance. Wind that came down off the ridge every evening like it had somewhere to be. Adeline Cross worked the floor at the Antler Saloon. That's all I'll say about the work, and it's all you need. She carried trays. She counted coins. She kept her back straight in a room full of men who'd had too much, and she did not let a single one of them see her flinch. When the night was over, she walked home alone in the cold, with her wages knotted into a handkerchief. She was careful in a way that people who have never been poor don't understand. Every coin she earned went into a tobacco tin she kept under a loose board by the stove. Not most of them. Every one she could spare. She'd sit at her little table by lamplight and count them into stacks, and then she'd count them again, because counting a thing twice is how you make sure the world hasn't quietly stolen from you while your back was turned. She was 26. She had been on her own since she was 15. She trusted arithmetic more than she trusted people, and she had good reasons for both. Her house was 2 rooms of raw plank on the edge of Maine, past where the boardwalk gave out. She rented it. She did not own it, and she knew the difference mattered. But it was hers in the way a thing is yours when you sweep it and keep it and lie down in it every night. She'd scrubbed the floors pale. She'd hung a curtain she sewed by hand. She kept a kettle and a good iron stove, and that stove was the whole trouble, because a stove is only as good as the room it stands in, and her room could not hold heat. The 2 window openings faced the wind. Someone before her had tacked oiled paper across them, the way poor folks did, because paper lets in light and costs almost nothing. But paper doesn't stop the cold. On the worst nights the wind found the edges of it and set it flapping, and the heat her stove made went straight out those 2 soft gray squares like water through a sieve. She'd wake with frost on the inside of her own blanket. She'd feed the fire and watch the warmth leave as fast as she could make it. That is a particular kind of tired, cold every night, and knowing exactly why, and not able to fix it on floor wages. So she had a plan. She was always making plans. Broken glass, she figured, was still glass. If she gathered enough of the cracked tumblers the saloon threw out, the ones with a chip in the lip or a crack running up the side, she could grind the shards down smooth, fit the pieces into the frames like a puzzle, seal them with pitch, and let a little real light and a little less wind into her 2 rooms. It would look like nothing. It would be a window made of garbage. But it would be glass. And glass holds where paper fails, and she'd have done it herself, with nobody's leave and nobody's bill. That was the shape of her when the story starts. Precise, proud, cold, every night, and planning her way out of it, one broken glass at a time. Now let me tell you about the man at the end of the bar. Elias Vance came in most evenings and drank almost nothing. He'd order one whiskey and make it last 2 hours. He sat at the far end, near the wall, where he could see the door. He was maybe 40. Big through the shoulders, gone a little heavy the way men do when the work leaves them. He owned Vance Freight and Supply, a hauling outfit down by the depot, wagons, mules, a warehouse, a name painted on a board. 4 years back it had been a going concern. He'd had contracts with the mines and a crew of drivers and money coming in. But 4 years back was also when he'd lost his wife. And the two things were tangled together in a way nobody in town said out loud, but everybody understood. After Marta died, the ledgers stopped getting kept. The contracts lapsed. The mules got sold one at a time to cover what the books should have covered. A man can run a business into the ground fast if he decides not to look at it, and grief is a fine excuse not to look. Elias Vance hadn't looked in 4 years. He was not a talker. He watched. And on that Saturday night, from the end of the bar, he watched Adeline Cross set down her tray and lean across the wood toward Fen Boyd, who owned the place. "Fen," she said, "could I have the chipped glasses you set aside?" Boyd was wiping the bar. He didn't stop. "The cracked ones? For the ash heap? Those, the ones you throw out." She said it level. "The chipped ones you set aside each week. Could I have them? What in the world for?" And here she almost didn't answer. You could see her decide. She was not a woman who explained herself to people who hadn't earned it. But Boyd wasn't unkind, only nosy, so she gave him the small true thing and no more. "My windows," she said. "I'm going to fill my windows." Boyd made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite kind, and he said, "Sure, take them. They're bound for the trash anyway." And that was the whole of it. A floor girl asking for garbage. It should have died right there on the bar. But Elias Vance had heard both sentences, the one she said and the one she didn't. He heard windows, and he heard cold, and something in him that had been shut for 4 years turned over in its sleep. He didn't say anything. That's the part I want you to hold on to, because it's easy to miss. He didn't offer to help. He didn't cross the room. He did one small thing, and nobody in that saloon read it, and I almost didn't tell you about it, but it's the whole seed of everything that comes after. His glass was half full. Good whiskey, no crack in it, a perfectly sound glass. When Boyd came down the bar with the tray for the set-aside glasses, the chipped ones, gathering for Adeline, Elias reached out and set his own good glass on that tray. Sound glass, half the whiskey still in it. Put it right in with the broken ones, like it belonged there. Boyd blinked at it. "That one's fine, Elias, set it aside anyway," Vance said. And that was all. You'd have to be paying very close attention to think anything of it. Nobody was. Boyd shrugged and left it. "One more glass for the girl. But I want you to remember it, because a man had just started, very quietly, making sure there were more glasses set aside than the week would naturally produce. He was going to keep doing it, too, week after week. And it would be a long time before anyone understood why. That should have been a small kindness that stayed small. It didn't, because of Mrs. Odell Fry. Mrs. Fry was the assayer's wife, and she ran the aisle at the Mercantile the way a general runs a hill. She'd been in the Antler that night. Respectable women did come in, to fetch their husbands, or to be seen fetching them, and she'd heard the exchange at the bar. By Monday morning, she had shaped it into something with a point on it. A girl like that, she said to the 3 women gathered by the dry goods, loud enough for the counter and the door, "wants glass for her windows." She let it sit. Glass for her windows. As if the 2 words together were an indecency. As if a saloon girl wanting to see out of her own house, wanting to keep the wind off her own bed, was a kind of reaching above her station that decent people ought to note and remember. That's how it works in a small town. Gossip almost never starts as a lie. It starts as a true thing said in a certain tone. Adeline had asked for broken glass. That was true. Mrs. Fry only added the sneer, and the sneer did the rest. By Tuesday, the whole aisle knew that the Cross girl had notions. By Wednesday, the notions had a shape. Wanting things. Wanting to rise. Wanting in a girl who had no business wanting, and the town filed it away against her the way a bank files a debt. Adeline didn't hear it yet. She was gathering her broken glasses and hiding her tobacco tin and going cold to bed, planning her puzzle windows, knowing nothing of the story being built around her one aisle over. Then came the following Tuesday, and the wagon. It was the middle of the afternoon, the town awake and out, the boardwalk busy. And down Main came a freight wagon, not Vance's own painted rig, a plain hired one, and it did not stop at the depot or the mercantile or the bank. It rolled all the way down past the end of the boardwalk, out to where the plank houses stood, and it stopped at the door of Adeline Cross. On the bed of that wagon, packed in straw against the ruts, were 12 lights of window glass. Real window glass, clear and flat and new, each pane bigger than a serving tray. There was a wooden tub of putty, there was a glazier's knife wrapped in cloth. And there was a man, quiet, gray-haired, careful-handed, named Otto Reese, who set glass for a living, and had been paid to set this. 12 panes. You have to understand what that was worth. That was more than Adeline earned on the floor in a good long stretch. Clear window glass, freighted up to 4,000 feet over mountain roads, did not come cheap, and everyone on that street knew to the dollar roughly what it cost, because that's the kind of thing a mining town knows. Glass worth more than a season of her wages, delivered in daylight to a dance house girl's rented door. And no name came with it. Otto had a work order and a paid bill and instructions to set the glass, and when folks asked him who sent it, and they did ask, right there in the street, he only said he wasn't at liberty, and unwrapped his knife. Now picture the street seeing it. Because they did see it, all of them. Mrs. Fry saw it from the mercantile step. Boyd heard about it before the wagon was unloaded. Aldous Creben, who managed the Halloran Merchants Bank and held the paper on half the town, walked past on his way to dinner and slowed just enough to look, and then walked on faster. 12 panes of glass. To her. From no one. You know what the town decided in about the time it takes to draw a breath. A girl like that. Glass like that. From a man with no name to sign it. There is only one story a town tells itself about that, and it is not a kind one, and it doesn't wait for facts. The verdict lit up the whole street at once, and it burned toward her house like a line of powder. And here is the cruelty of it, the thing that would have made a lesser woman weep. She hadn't asked for it. She had asked for garbage. She had a plan made of broken glasses and her own 2 hands, and it cost nobody anything, and shamed nobody, and now a stranger's generosity had done to her name in one afternoon what her whole careful life had been built to prevent. The gift was an accusation. The gift said, in the town's ear, that somebody had bought something. And everyone knew what. Adeline came home from an errand to find a wagon at her door, and Otto Rice measuring her window frames and 12 panes of glass leaning in the straw, catching the light. Neighbors on their stoops, watching, she stood very still. She did not cry, and she did not shout. She asked Otto who sent it. He told her he couldn't say. She asked him twice more, in 3 different ways, and he was sorry and kind, and would not say, and he kept measuring. because that was the job. Her first thought, I want you to hear it because it tells you exactly who she was. Her first thought was, send it back. All of it. Every pane. Load it on the wagon and send it back where it came from. Because she would not be bought, and now the whole town was going to say she had been, and the only way to answer that was to refuse the thing entirely and let them watch her refuse it. She told Otto to load it back up. Otto said, gently, that he'd been paid to set it, not to return it, and that he had no address to return it to anyhow. No name, remember. She couldn't send it back to no one. She stood in her own doorway with 12 panes of glass she hadn't asked for, and couldn't refuse, and couldn't afford, and couldn't explain, and the oiled paper in her 2 windows flapping in the wind behind her, and she understood that whoever had done this had done it in a way she could not undo. Fen Boyd found her that evening before her shift. He wasn't cruel about it. He liked her, in his way. But he ran a business, and the town was his business. Addie, he said, the glass. It's a story now. You know that. I didn't ask for it. I know you didn't. Doesn't matter. 12 panes to your door and no name on 'em, and every soul on Main saw it. That's a story, and the story's got your name in it, and mine on the sign over your head. He rubbed his jaw. I'm not saying anything. I'm telling you what's being said. She kept her chin up. But she felt the floor tilt. Krebin passed her on the boardwalk 2 days later. She'd seen him tip his hat to women all over town, women with less right to it than she had, women whose only virtue was a husband. He'd always given her a small nod before, not warm, but a nod, the courtesy you'd give a dog you didn't mind. This time, he looked at her, and looked away, and did not tip his hat at all. And that told her more than Boyd's whole speech. The bank had decided. The bank had entered her in a ledger somewhere, under a heading she hadn't chosen. Then, the mercantile shorted her. It was small. It was meant to be small. She bought flour and salt and a spool of thread, and when the clerk made her change, he made it wrong, a few cents wrong, in the store's favor. And when she pointed it out, quietly, precisely, because she was always precise about coins, he took his time correcting it, and Mrs. Fry watched the whole thing from the end of the counter, with her mouth set like a seam. A few cents. But Adeline understood a few cents. A few cents was the town telling her that her arithmetic no longer had the same standing as theirs. That she could be shorted now, and made to argue for her own pennies, and be looked at while she did it. And then Boyd docked her a shift. Just till the talk dies, he said, and he wouldn't meet her eye. 1 shift a week. Gone. On-floor wages. 1 shift is not nothing. 1 shift is the difference in the tobacco tin. The gift that was supposed to warm her house was costing her the money to heat it, and it hadn't even been set in the frames yet. The 12 panes leaned against her wall, wrapped in Otto's cloth, and every day they sat there they cost her something, and she still did not know. From whom? So she went looking. She was not a woman to sit in a fog. She wanted the name. She reasoned it out the way she reasoned out everything, who had the money, who had the reason, who had been near enough that Saturday to hear about the glasses. She thought about the freight. A hired wagon, but freight all the same, and who in Halloran knew freight. She thought about the quiet man at the end of the bar who never talked and always watched, the one whose business was hauling and whose wife was 4 years dead. She didn't corner him. She watched him, the way he'd watched her. And over those weeks she noticed a thing that made no sense to her at all. Elias Vance was breaking glasses. Not in temper. Carefully, he'd come in, take his 1 whiskey, and drink it from one of the good tumblers, and then, she began to catch it, he'd set that glass down a little too hard on the bar's edge, or knock it just so against the brass rail, and put a chip in the lip or a crack up the side. And then he'd push it toward Boyd with the others, ruined, for the set-aside tray. Sound glasses, made unsound on purpose, added to the pile of broken ones that were, everyone knew, being saved for the Cross girl and her windows. She watched him do it 3 times before she was sure she wasn't imagining it. A grown man, a business owner, sitting alone and quietly cracking saloon glasses so that more of them would end up in a tray marked for her. She could not make it fit anything she understood. It wasn't the wagon was too grand, too public, a thing that shouted. This was the opposite. This was small and secret and steady and pointed nowhere but at her, and it asked for nothing, and it made no sense, and it frightened her more than the wagon had. Because Adeline Cross had one deep flaw, and I'll name it plainly so you can watch it work. She believed every kindness carried a hidden bill. She had learned it hard, and she had learned it young, and it had kept her safe for 11 years. Nobody gives you something for nothing. So when a kindness came that truly asked for nothing, that was built, in fact, to ask for nothing, she couldn't see it. She had no shelf to put it on. Her whole life had trained her to find the bill, and the one time there was no bill, the absence of it read like a trap. So she sat with the glass. Both kinds. The 12 panes against her wall, and the mystery of a man cracking tumblers on purpose. And being who she was, she did the only thing she trusted. She reasoned it out. If someone wanted to buy her, she thought, they'd send something she could sell. Money, or a thing worth money, a brooch, a horse, dress goods, something she could carry to the mercantile and turn back into coin. That's how buying works. You give a thing that can be converted, and the converting is the hold you keep. But window glass, freighted up to Halloran, could not be sold here for anything near what it had cost. There was no market for it. It was too dear and too fragile and too plainly used. Nobody in this dying town was buying window glass off a saloon girl. And more than that, the glass improved a house she didn't even own. She rented. When she left, and she would leave, someday, she always meant to leave, the glass stayed. It went to the landlord. It was the one gift that could not follow her, could not be cashed, could not be worn or shown or turned to account. It did exactly one thing. It kept the wind off her bed. Nothing else. It could not be construed, by any honest reckoning, as buying her, because there was nothing in it to buy with. And she stopped, in her cold house, with that thought, because she understood what it meant. Whoever sent it had known all that. Had thought it through the exact way she just had. Had chosen the one gift in the whole world that could warm her and could not own her. Had gone to the trouble of finding the single thing that gave her everything and took nothing and left her free. That is not the reasoning of a man buying a woman. That is the reasoning of a man trying very hard to give her something without putting a chain on it. And he'd had to think as carefully as she thought to do it. That was the first thing about Elias Vance she could not dismiss, and she'd built her whole life out of dismissing things. Winter was coming down off the ridge for real now. She could smell it in the evenings, that iron smell that means the cold is done playing. The oiled paper in her windows had another month in it, maybe, before the hard freezes, and then those 2 gray squares would let the winter into her rooms every night until spring. She had 12 panes of clear glass leaning against her wall that would fix it entirely, that would change her cold house into a warm one, and Otto Rice had left word through Boyd that he'd stay in town a few more days if she wanted the setting done, at no further charge, already paid. All she had to do was let him. And that was the whole knot. If she let Otto set that glass, in daylight, in the front windows where all of Maine could see it, she was accepting it. Publicly, forever, she was standing in her own doorway and telling the town, in a language it could not misread, that she had taken the widower's glass and kept it. She'd be the girl who was bought, confirmed, on display, 12 panes of proof shining out at the street. Boyd would dock her more. Krebin would look away for good. Mrs. Fry's aisle would have its verdict nailed to the wall. Or she could keep her clean name and stay cold. Send Otto off. Let the panes sit wrapped against the wall as a thing she never used. Grind her broken glasses down and fill her windows with garbage after all, the way she'd planned. And be respectable, and freezing, and right. That was the choice. And she stood in it for a long time. She stood in it long enough to feel the wind find the edge of the oiled paper and set it flapping, that sound she'd fallen asleep to and woken to for 2 winters. She stood in it long enough for the low sun to come slanting through the gap where the paper had torn, and land on the wrapped stack of panes, and glow there, 12 clean sheets of it, waiting. She thought about frost on the inside of her blanket. She thought about the tobacco tin under the board, and how many nights of cold it stood for, and how it had never once bought her a warm room, and maybe never would. She thought about a man cracking glasses at the end of a bar, asking her for nothing. She reached out and pulled the wrapping cloth off the top pane, and she looked at her own face in it, half in shadow, chin up. And in the morning, in full daylight, with the boardwalk waking and Mrs. Fry not yet at her post, but soon to be, Adeline Cross walked down to the Antler, found Otto Rice at his breakfast, and told him to bring his knife and his putty and set the glass. He looked at her a moment. Then he nodded, the way a man nods at someone who's decided something hard, and he reached for his coat. She walked back up Main ahead of him, straight-backed, in the cold, clear light, toward her 2 paper windows and the 12 panes that were going to fill them, and toward whatever the town was going to make of a saloon girl who'd stopped pretending she didn't want to be warm. She did not look to see who was watching. She knew they were. Otto Rice came up the road behind her with his knife and his putty, and he did not hurry, and he did not look at the boardwalk either. He set his tools down on the step. He peeled back the oiled paper from the first frame, and the wind took it, and for one breath the whole cold morning poured into the house the way it always had. Then he lifted the first pane out of its cloth. She watched him work. He was a careful man. He laid the bed of putty in the frame with his thumb, even and slow, and he pressed the glass down into it, and he trimmed the seam clean. The pane sat there in the wood like it had grown there. Light came through it. Not the soft blind glow of the paper. Real light. Sharp and true. And her 2 rooms looked suddenly like rooms and not like a box she slept in. People stopped on Main to watch. She felt them. Mrs. Fry came to her post at the mercantile door and stood with her hands folded and said nothing, which for Mrs. Fry was a kind of shout. Boyd stood in the door of the Antler with a rag in his hand and watched a saloon girl glaze her windows in daylight, and he did not call her in early, and he did not call her anything at all. Adeline did not hide from any of it. She stood in her own doorway with her chin up and let them look. When Otto set the last of the 12, the whole front of her house was full of glass. 12 lights of it. She could see the mountains through her own window now. She could see her own breath stop fogging the air inside within the hour, because the wind had nowhere left to come in. She went to the shelf where she kept her few things, and took down one of the chipped tumblers she'd carried up from the Antler in her apron, weeks back, before any of this. A cracked one. Boyd's cast-off. She'd meant to grind a whole tin of them into shards and pack her window frames with the pieces. That had been the plan. That had been the whole plan. She didn't need them for windows now. So she took the one glass, the worst cracked one, and she sat on her step in the cold light with a scrap of sandstone, and she ground the broken lip of it down herself. Slow, round, until the jagged place where it had chipped was smooth as a river stone and would not cut a lip. She worked at it a long while. Her hands went red. When it was done, she washed it and set it up on the new sill, in the new light, and the low sun came straight through the glass she hadn't bought and struck the glass she'd mended with her own 2 hands, and it caught fire the way cheap glass will when the light is right. That was hers. Whatever the rest of it was, whatever the town was going to say, that one glass on that one sill was a thing she had made. Otto packed his knife. She paid him what she could, and he took it, because a man's work should be paid for, and he knew that as well as she did. Then he did a strange thing. He didn't leave. Winter came down hard that week. Real winter, the kind that lives at 4,000 feet and comes early and stays. The first true storm scoured Maine clean of everyone, and her house held. She sat in it that first hard night, and there was frost on the outside of her glass, feathered and white, and none on the inside. None at all. She'd never in 2 winters seen the inside of a window without frost. She put her hand flat to the cold pane and felt the storm on the far side of it. And the storm stayed there. Firewood appeared at her door. She woke one morning and there was a cord of it stacked neat against her wall, split and dry, and no note, and no name, and no one to thank. She stood over it a long time. She almost hated it. Another thing given. Another thing she hadn't asked for. She told herself she'd find out who and pay them back, and she carried an armful inside because a body has to be warm. And she burned it. And it warmed her. And that was its own kind of bill she couldn't read the bottom line of. Otto stayed on an extra day. He said her door hung wrong. It did. It had hung wrong since she'd rented the place, dragging on its bottom edge, letting a draft under it you could read by. He took it off its hinges and planed it true and rehung it, and it swung shut with a sound she'd never heard it make, a soft, whole sound. Sealed, she brought him coffee for it. And standing there in her doorway that no longer dragged, she asked him. She'd been circling it for a day, and she finally just asked, "Who sends a man 12 panes of glass and doesn't put his name on it?" Otto drank his coffee. He was an old man, gray all through, and he'd set glass in a lot of houses, a man who set glass in the right house before, he said, and lost the person in it anyway. She waited. Elias Vance's wife, Otto said. Marta. She came out here with him. First winter they had. Little plank house, worse than this one. Paper in the windows. He looked at her window when he said it. She took a lung fever that winter, and it never let go of her. She was gone by the spring. 4 years back now. He set the cup down. He doesn't talk about it. But I've set glass for him in 3 cold houses since, for folks who couldn't pay, and he pays me and tells me leave his name off it. He can't stand a paper window. That's the whole of it, miss. He can't stand to know there's a paper window in this town and a person behind it come January. She didn't say anything. There wasn't a thing to say. He heard you ask Boyd, Otto said, gentler now. That's all it was. He heard you ask for the broken ones, and he knew what you meant to do with them, and he knew it wasn't enough. He picked up his kit. I'll go now. Door won't drag on you anymore. He went. And she stood in her warm sealed house with the frost on the outside of the glass, and she understood the shape of it now, all of it, and understanding it did not make it lighter. It made it heavier. Because now it had a dead woman in it. Now it had a name. The town did not stop talking just because she understood. The mercantile still shorted her a nickel on her change and dared her with a flat face to count it out loud. Boyd docked her a floor shift. 2, said it plain. Till the talk dies, Addie. It's not me. It's them. And the docked coins that didn't go into the tobacco tin under her board were the price of 12 panes she'd never asked for, paid in a currency the man who sent them had never once thought to count. And down at the Halloran Merchants Bank, Aldous Krebin called the note. She heard it from Boyd, who heard it from everyone. $600 against Vance Freight and Supply, 90 days to pay, and the town made it a sermon. There was the proof, they said. There was where charity for dance house girls led a man. Buy a saloon girl a wagon of window glass with money you owe the bank and see how the ledger likes it. They said it in the aisle, and they said it on the boardwalk, and they made Elias Vance a fool in his own town, and they made her the reason. She hadn't asked for any of it. She reminded herself of that. It didn't help. Then, in the deepest part of that winter of 1881, the storm came that the glass was for. It came down out of the north with no daylight in it at all. 2 days it built, and the third day it broke over Halloran and buried Maine to the second step. Nobody moved in it. Nobody could. Addie was banked in with her firewood and her 12 panes, warm, sealed. The frost climbing the outside of her windows in white ferns. She heard the knock through the wind. Barely, she almost didn't. She opened her true-hung door, and there was Sarah Pike from 2 doors down, the seamstress, with her shawl white over, and her little girl Letty in her arms. And Letty was 15 months old, and burning up with fever in a house with paper in the windows. "I can't keep the room warm," Sarah said. Her mouth could barely make the words. "I've burned everything. The paper won't hold the heat, and she's so hot and then so cold, and I didn't know where else. I didn't." "Bring her in," Addie said. She brought them in. She shut the true door on the storm, and it stayed shut. She built the fire high with the wood a man had left with no name on it, and she laid the feverish child down near it, and Sarah Pike stood in the middle of Addie's 2 rooms and looked at the 12 panes, with the storm raging white behind every one of them and not one draft coming through, and she started to cry. Because her own house, 2 doors down, was letting the winter walk straight through it, and this one was not. They worked over the child all night. Cool cloths when the fever spiked, the fire when the chill came. And the house held. That was the thing. The whole howling night the house held its heat because the wind had nowhere to get in, and the 12 lights of window glass stood between one small burning body and 4,000 feet of Nevada winter and did the one thing they'd been sent to do. Toward the grayest hour, Letty's fever broke. She went slick with sweat, and then she went cool, and then she slept, real sleep, her breath long and even, and Sarah Pike put her face down against her daughter and shook. There was frost thick on the outside of every pane by then, and inside the room was warm. The storm blew itself out by full morning, and the town that dug itself out of Maine that day woke to a new story, and it was not the one they'd been telling. The saloon girl at the edge of Halloran had kept Sarah Pike's baby alive through the worst night of the winter with a widower's window glass. Some of them softened at that. Mrs. Odell Fry, who had a soft place under all of it, whether she'd owned to it or not, softened at that. And some of them sharpened instead, because a story that changes on you is a hard thing to forgive, and there were those who'd said their piece too loud to take it back now. Adeline stood in her doorway in the clean cold after and watched the town sort itself. And she did the arithmetic she was so good at. 4 months. 4 months she'd been paying for 12 panes of glass in docked shifts and shorted change, and a name dragged up and down the aisle at the mercantile. 4 months in a currency Elias Vance had never counted when he sent them. He'd thought about whether the gift could buy her. He'd been so careful about that. And he'd never once thought about what it would cost her to keep it. She let the thaw come. She let March come. And when the roads were clear and the sun had some warmth in it again, she put on her coat and she walked in broad daylight down Main and across to the low building at the far end where the sign said Vance Freight A&D Supply, and she walked in the front door to settle her accounts. He was at the counter. Elias Vance, 4 years a widower, and he looked up at her coming in, and something moved across his face that he tried to put away and couldn't quite. "Miss Cross," he said. "I know it was you," she said. "She didn't sit. I've known a while. Otto told me why. About your wife. About the paper in her windows." He didn't deny it. He looked down at his counter. "So I want to say the thing plain," she said, "because you never did. You didn't buy me. I'll give you that. I watched you make sure of it. You picked the one thing you couldn't sell and couldn't take back and couldn't hold over my head, glass fixed into a house I don't even own, and you were so careful about it that it took me weeks to see how careful. You made sure you couldn't buy me." That's true, he said, low. But you spent 4 months of my name, she said, and you never asked me the price. I paid it. Docked shifts. A nickel a day at the mercantile just to remind me. Every woman in this town deciding what I was. I paid all of it, and you didn't know there was a bill, because you never asked. You solved my cold house for me. You didn't ask me one thing about what it would cost me to be warm. He stood there and took it. To his credit, he took it. So don't tell me what you're going to do for me next, she said. That's the whole trouble with you, I think. Don't tell me what you'll do for me. Ask me what I want to be. And he answered her badly. He answered her exactly as wrong as a good man can. Then marry me, he said. It came out of him fast, like he'd been holding it. You wouldn't have to work the antler floor. You'd be out of it. No one would talk again, Addie. Not one of them would dare. If you there, she said. And she almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. You hear yourself? You just did it again. Same hand. You'd take me out of the antler so the town stops talking. You'd solve it for me. You'd rescue me a second time with the very same hand you rescued me the first time, and you'd call it love, and it isn't. It's you fixing me like a warped door. She shook her head. I don't want to be the problem you solved twice. She reached into her coat. She'd carried it all the way down Main wrapped in a cloth. The chipped glass. The one she'd ground smooth with her own hands and set on her sill. She unwrapped it on his counter, and into it she counted out coins. Not all of $600. She didn't have $600. But every coin she could spare toward what the glass had cost, counted out one at a time into the mended glass, on top of his ledger, where he'd have to see it. That's toward the glass, she said. I pay my debts. I always have. And she left him standing there with a saloon girl's savings in a cast-off glass on his books. And she walked back up Main in the daylight, and she did not look to see who was watching, because by then she'd stopped caring who was. Spring came the rest of the way in. And Elias Vance sat with what she'd said the way a man sits with a stone in his boot he's afraid to take off and look at. Because she was right, and he knew she was right, and it was worse than that. His freight line was going under, and it wasn't the glass that did it, and it wasn't charity that did it. It was him. 4 years of grief, and a man who'd stopped keeping his own books the winter his wife died, and never truly started again. Kreben's 90 days ran on towards summer, $600. And Elias Vance, who could load a wagon and drive a team and read weather off a sky, could not tell you within $100 what his own business was worth, because he'd let the ledgers go the way he'd let everything go, quiet and slow. Since Marta. And across town there was a woman who counted every coin she owned into a tobacco tin under a loose board, and never lost track of one. He sat with that too. June came. The June light in that country is long and gold and full of dust, and it came through the front windows of the freight office and lay across the counter, and on the counter Elias Vance had every ledger he owned laid open. Not hidden. Open, he'd sent word up to the antler and asked her to come, in daylight. And she came in daylight, and she stood across the counter from him and looked at the mess of his accounts spread out between them. He didn't propose marriage. That's the first thing. He'd learned that much. I'm going under, he said. Weeks, maybe, Kreben's note comes due, and I can't tell him what I've got. Because I don't know what I've got. Because I haven't kept a real book since Marta died. He put his hand flat on the open ledger. You count better than anyone in this town. I've watched you do it for years, coin by coin, and never once wrong. What are you asking? She said. Careful, braced for it. Half, he said. Half of Vance Freight and Supply. Your name on the deed of partnership. You buy in with that tin of yours and with your head for figures, because the second one is worth more than the first and we both know it. You keep the books. You run the money. I drive and I load and I do what I'm good for, and you do what you're good for, and maybe the line doesn't go under after all. He looked at her steady. That's the offer. It's a business offer. It stands on its own. She looked at him. And the other thing, he said. The marriage. I'm setting it aside. On purpose. I'm not tying it to this. It's a separate question and it's yours to answer, later or never, whichever you want, and this offer doesn't move whether you answer it or not. He took a breath. I'm not solving anything for you this time. I'm asking you what you want to be. You want to be a partner in a freight line, Miss Cross, here's the papers. Read every line of them. I know you will. And she did. She read every line. She stood at his counter in the June light, and she read the deed of partnership top to bottom. And she read his ledgers with a sharper eye than he'd ever brought to them, and by the time she got to the bottom of the second book, she could already see 2 places he was bleeding money that a kept book would have stopped a year ago. She set the papers down. Yes, she said, to the business. Yes, nothing about the other thing. Not yet. And he didn't ask. That was the whole point, and he'd finally learned it, and he let it sit. They signed it public. She made sure of that. She'd learned something too, over that long cold winter, about doing a thing in daylight where the whole town has to watch you do it. They went to the county clerk's counter, and they signed the partnership onto the record, and word ran ahead of them the way word runs in a small town, and by the time they came back down to the freight office there was a little crowd of the curious and the doubtful gathered to see it. Fen Boyd was there. He'd closed the Antler an hour to come. He looked at Adeline for a moment. This woman who'd worked his floor and taken his docked shifts and never once let him see it land. And he took off his hat. Miss Cross, he said. Not Addie, Miss Cross. First time in the 11 years he'd known her. She took that. She'd earned it. Aldous Krebin came too, because a banker goes where the money moves, and here was the part the town would tell for years. The $600 note came due that summer, and it was paid. To the day, paid out of a freight line that had a bookkeeper now, a real one, who found the money that had been leaking out of it and stopped the leak and made the payment on the very day it fell. Krebin had to take the payment. He had to mark the note discharged and stamp it paid. And when it was done, Aldous Krebin, who had passed this same woman on the boardwalk all winter and never tipped his hat to her. She watched him do it. She didn't smile. She just marked it, the way she marked everything, and filed it away. And Mrs. Odell Fry stood in the doorway of the freight office where she'd come to see what there was to say. And for once in her life, the aisle had nothing. There was no story left in it. The saloon girl who'd been bought by a foolish widower was a business partner with her name on a deed, and the widower's line was solvent for the first time in 4 years. And the child 2 doors down was alive, and there was simply nothing there for Mrs. Fry to carry back to the mercantile. She stood a moment. Then she went home, and the aisle went quiet, and stayed quieter after. They raised a new sign over the freight yard that summer. Fresh paint. Elias Vance had wanted her name on it, and she'd told him where to put it, and he'd put it there. Not Vance. Not Vance A.N.D. Cross. Cross A.N.D. Vance, it read. Freight and glass. Her name first, because she'd made him put it first, and because he'd wanted to. The next winter came around the way it always does at 4,000 feet, and in a 2-room plank house on the edge of Halloran, a house she still rented and still called hers, 12 lights of window glass stood clear and warm against the cold, with the frost climbing the outside and none on the in. The firewood was stacked full against the wall, and on the sill, in the low winter light, sat one chipped drinking glass, ground smooth by her own hand a year before, and it didn't hold water now, and it didn't hold coins now. It held dried flowers, summer flowers she'd picked and kept, gone papery and gold, standing in a saloon's cast-off glass on a windowsill, catching the sun. Sarah Pike sat at her table. Little Letty, walking now, 2 years old and stout, and loud, banged a spoon, and was alive. They came often. The house that had saved the child was a warm place to be, and warm places draw people, and Adeline Cross, who had spent 2 winters alone in the cold, now had a table people came to. The other questions sat on the mantel, so to speak. Unanswered, unhurried, Elias Vance came by that winter and left firewood at her door the way he always had. But this time, he knocked. And she opened the true hung door that didn't drag, and she let him in out of the cold, into the warm room with the 12 panes and the flowers in the glass, and the way she looked at him made it plain enough what the answer to that last question was going to be. Yes, in her time. On her terms. With her name kept first. But yes. Aldous Creben balanced his ledger that year and found it agreed with his conscience for once, which surprised him. Mrs. Fry's aisle stayed quiet, and she found she didn't miss the noise as much as she'd have guessed. And a saloon girl who'd asked a barman for the broken glasses he set aside got a warm house, and a business with her name on it, and a man who'd finally learned the difference. Because that was the difference, in the end. She'd asked for the broken glasses. He'd heard the 2 paper windows. And a man who solves your problem for you and a man who asks you what you want to be are not the same man, even when they've got the same face and the same kind hands. One of them keeps you, the other one chooses you, and lets you choose back. She chose back. On the sill the flowers caught the light, in the glass she'd mended herself. If someone once gave you the exact thing you needed, the thing nobody else thought to give, tell us what it was, and comment the coldest place you've ever tried to keep warm. I want to see how far this one travels.